Hey there kiddos, here's your video on factoring and four-term grouping. We're going to start a new unit today called factoring. So the last unit, the one you just took a test over, is all about multiplying polynomials together. And so we learned the box method and we learned double distribution and we multiplied two polynomials together and got a new polynomial as an answer. Now with factoring, it's the opposite of that. So we're going to be undoing the multiplication. So we're basically dividing the polynomials, but we're going to do it by something called factoring. And there's several different ways to do this, and there's several different ways to approach it. So we're going to start with just GCF and four-term grouping, so we can just roll into this with the basics, and then we'll step into it and put it all together as we go through the week. So your notes here start with determining all the possible factors for 8 and 12. And then listing the largest factor they have in common. There are two ways to do this, and I know this seems like elementary because you should know how to find the greatest common factor, but it's going to come in handy because not everybody knows the greatest common factor of 8 and 12 off the top of their head. And what I'm about to show you will really help. So the greatest common factor of 8, we make this T-chart, and we're going to just list all the factors of 8. So there's 1 and 8, there's 2 and 4, and then we repeat, we get 4 and 2, and so now we've got them all. And then all the factors of 12, we've got 1 and 12, there's 2 and 6, there's 3 and 4, and so now you've listed them all. And so the biggest number that both of these have in common is this 4. So the greatest common factor of 8 and 12 is 4. And we're going to be using these T-charts a lot as we go through our notes today. So those T-charts are going to come in handy. Even if you can locate the greatest common factor of the two numbers easily, I want you to go through this process with me because it's going to be way helpful as we get along and start making things, stacking things on top of each other this week. So 2, 3, and 4 here, they just ask us to find the GCF of the given problems. And so we're going to do number 2. I've got 15y cubed and negative 20y squared. The fact that the 20 is negative is not important because we're looking for the greatest common factor, and since one's positive, one's negative, the biggest factor is going to be a positive because positive is always bigger than a negative. So we're going to list all the factors of 15. So I have 1 and 15, 3 and 5. And then this y cubed means y times y times y. And I know it seems juvenile, but please list it out. I promise later this is going to come in so handy. So then our negative 20, we're just going to list factors of 20 because the negative is not going to affect where our greatest common factor is this time. So our factors of 20 are 1 and 20, 2 and 10, 4 and 5. And then y squared means y times y. Well, so I'm going to go through my T-charts here. 5 is the biggest number they have in common. And so the pairs that I didn't do anything with, I'm going to cross off. And then if I look at my y's, I'm going to circle all the ones they have in common till I can't circle anymore. And so what I have is the greatest common factor is the 5. And then they each have 2 y's in common, so y squared. And that's how we find the greatest common factor of monomials. So let's do number 4. This one has 3 terms or 3 different numbers to find the GCF of instead of just 2, but we're going to do it the same way. So we're going to make our T-chart again. Factors of 60, we have 1 and 60, 2 and 30, 3 and 20, 4 and 15, 5 and 12, 6 and 10, and I think that's it. And then we have to list out our R's, our S's, and our T's. So I have R times R, S times S, and T times T. Then for the 45, I'm going to list those as well. So I've got 1 and 45, 3 and 15, 5 and 9, and then my R's, S's, and T's. So I have R times R times R, T times T times T. And then my 30 here, I've got 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10, 5 and 6. And then my R's, S's, and T's, R times R, S, and then T times T times T times T. So there I've listed them all out. So I'm going to go through my T-charts first with all my factors, and I see that the biggest number they have in common is this 15. None of them have anything bigger than that in common, so my greatest common factor is going to start with the 15. And then for my variables, I'm going to start circling R's, S's, and T's until I can't circle anymore. And so each pair I have 2 that I have circled, so they have r squared in common. They do not all 3 have s's, so they do not have any s's in common, but for the t's, I will do the same. I'll start circling until one of my groups is completely out. So they each have 2 t's in common, so t squared. So this would be the greatest common factor of those 3 terms. So the reason we do this is because sometimes the easiest way to factor, the easiest way to split up a polynomial into the 2 things that multiplied to make it originally, is to use the greatest common factor. It's to find whatever the GCF is and take it out. And so if we look at number 5, I have a polynomial, 24a squared x cubed minus 56ax cubed minus 8x. I'm going to just pull out the greatest common factor, and then whatever is remaining is going to be the other factor, because whenever you factor something, there's always 2 of them. Okay, so like factors of the number 2 are 1 times 2, so it has 2 factors. And so I'm going to have to, the greatest common factor will be one factor. What is left after I take that out will be the other. So we're going to start with our t-charts. We're going to list all our factors. So I have 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6. And then I have a times a and x times x times x. Then I have for my 56, I have 1 and 56, 2 and 28, we have 4 and 14, and then we have 7 times 8. So there are our factors. And then I have my a and my x times x. And then for the number 8, I have my 1 and 8, my 2 and 4, and then my x. And so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to use a different color so that we can see it a little better. I'm going to circle what they have in common. So the biggest number that they happen to have in common is this 4. Nope, it is not that 4. I lied. It is the 8. Would help if I'd actually find the biggest number. The biggest number they happen to have in common is the number 8. Okay, so I've circled my 8s. Now all of the pairs of numbers that didn't get used are going to get crossed out. So we'll cross out the pairs. Do not cross off the extra factor that went with your 8. Keep it. It will come in handy. Then I will start with my A's. I'll circle what I can. And then don't cross off the rest. So the stuff that is circled is my greatest common factor. So my greatest common factor is 8ax. So I'm going to take out an 8ax. The stuff that isn't circled or crossed off is what remains after I take the 8 and the a and the x out of that term. So the thing that is left for the 24 is this 3, an a, and x squared. Then I have this minus sign. And the things that are left here are this 7 and 1x. And then I have my minus sign. And the only thing that's left here is this 1. And so that is now factored. Those 2 things, the 8ax and then that polynomial, 3x squared minus 7x minus 1, are the 2 factors of that original polynomial. They go, when I multiply them together, they go back and make the polynomial that I started with. So all I've done is pulled it apart into the 2 factors. So we're going to do one more so that you can see how that works. And then we're going to switch to something called 4-term grouping. So let's look down here. Let's do number 10. Here's the thing about number 10. Every term on number 10 has a minus sign in front of it. So I'm going to use negatives this time when I write down my factors. So for negative 10, and it's going to make my little table really long, I'm going to have negative 1 and 10. And I'm going to have 1 and negative 10. It's going to, yes, you need to list both because it's going to come in really handy. You're going to need to see which one they have in common. And then I'm going to have 2, negative 2 and 5, and then 2 and negative 5. And then I have my e's. And then we'll do the negative 6. So the factors of negative 6 are negative 1 and 6, or 1 and negative 6. And then negative 2 and 3. Or 2 and negative 3. And then that one has 3 e's. And then my 8. So my factors for negative 8 are negative 1 and 8, or 1 and negative 8. Negative 2 and 4, or 2 and negative 4. and then it only has one E. So we're going to circle what they have in common. So what I want to look at is my table. They all have the 1 and -1, the 2 and -2. That's great. So they all have those, and then let's look. That's the only things they have in common. So the biggest number in that list that they happen to have in common is this +2. They also have the -2 in common, but we want the biggest one, and so the biggest one happens to be the +2. So we're going to take the +2, and then we're going to cross off the pairs that we didn't use. And then we'll circle our E's. And we're going to write down what we circled. So what we circled was a 2 and an E. Whoops. And then what didn't get circled was this -5. And then e to the 4th. And then this -3 with this e squared. And then this -4. So there happens to be, now I've factored, those are my two terms that when I multiply them together make my original polynomial. So I have my GCF and then what was remaining. And that's how we factor with the greatest common factor. So now let's talk about another method, because sometimes instead of having just 3 terms we need to factor, you've got 4. And when you have 4 terms you need to factor, we can go about doing it using the greatest common factor, but sometimes the only thing they have in common is a 1. And so we have to have another method for factoring. And so we're going to do something called 4-term grouping, which looks a lot like the box method. So I'm going to show you both. We're going to use the box, and then I'm going to show you 4-term grouping so you can see that they end up the same. And then we'll practice it one more time, both with the box and then 4-term grouping, and then you can pick the one you like the best. So we're going to start with this polynomial. I've got 3x cubed minus 4x squared plus 6x minus 8. And so if I look at this, 3, 4, 6, and 8, and if you go list out all your factors, the only thing they have in common is a 1. So it doesn't help you to pull out a greatest common factor, because 1 times anything just makes what you started with. So we have to use something different. So we're going to use the box method. I have 4 terms, so my box has to have 4 little pieces. And so this time we're going to start inside the box, and we're trying to figure out what goes outside. So we're going to fill this in. 3x cubed goes here, then minus 4x squared, then plus 6x, and minus 8. So now it's all about pulling out the greatest common factor, and if we need to make our t-charts, we will, so we can make our charts for what they have in common. So our 3 and our -4, let's list our factors for 3 and 4, and so we can see what they have in common. So this one's just 1 and 3, this one's 1 and 4, and 2 and 2. Well, the only thing they have in common is that 1, but the x's will be what's important. So I have 3 of them, and I have 2 of them, so they have 2 in common. So what they have in common is a 1x squared. Now for the bottom row, they don't both have x's. I'm just going to have to check my greatest common factor for my numbers. So for 6, I've got 1 and 6, 2 and 3. And for the -8, I've got 1 and 8, 2 and 4. Well, the biggest number they have in common is this 2. And so I'm going to have a 2 right here. Now for these rows, I've got to do it again. So I've got for my 3, I already wrote them down, but I have 1 and 3. And then for the 6, I have 1 and 6, 2 and 3. And then I have my x cubed and my x. So they have the 3 in common, and they have an x in common. So what's left here is the 3 and the x. And then for this next row, they're both negative, so whatever I take out is going to have to be negative. So for my 4, I have 1 and -4. I have 2 and -2. And then for my 8, I have 1 and -8. I have 2 and -4. And that's it. And so they have a -4 in common, and that's all. So I have a -4. So my factors for this become what's outside the box. So my factors are x squared plus 2 times 3x minus 4. And if I used what we learned in the last unit, and I put this and I made a box and multiplied, or I double distributed, this right here would make this polynomial. So now let's talk about 4-term grouping so that you can see that it is the same thing. It'll do the same thing for you. It works exactly like the box, only it's not, you don't have to draw the box. So 4-term grouping, first you start off by, you have your original problem. As the name says, you've got to have 4 terms to do this method. If you don't have 4 terms, it doesn't work. But I can. Now that I have my 4 terms, I'm going to group them. These 2 group together. These 2 group together. And then I'm just going to work with one group at a time. So I'm going to start with that 3x cubed minus 4x squared, which happens to be this row of the box. And I've got to pull out its greatest common factor. Well, the good news is we already took care of that over here. And the only thing these 2 terms have in common is that x squared. Now, since I already took care of this over here, I will write down what was left after I took out the 1 and the x squared. Well, this one had a 3 and an x left. And this one had the minus 4 left. Then for this 6x and minus 8, it was this bottom row. When I took care of it, it's all right here. And you can see that my greatest common factor for that was this 2. So I'm going to take out my 2 for that. And then what is left is what goes inside. So this one right here has a 3 and there's an x because it had an x here. I just didn't write it the first time. So I have a 3 and an x goes here. And then my 4 minus 4. And it's minus because this was minus. And so now what you should notice is that your 2 sets of parentheses match. So this you've got 3x minus 4 in parentheses and 3x minus 4 in parentheses. That should always happen because if your parentheses match, then you know with 4-term grouping you have done this correctly. If the parentheses don't match, that's your key that you've made a mistake. But my parentheses match. So for my answer, one of my 2 factors is 3x minus 4. And you'll see that that was one of my factors from before with the box method. My other factor is what's not, stupid cat, what's not in parentheses becomes your other factor. So now this is going to be x squared plus 2. So my other factor is x squared plus 2. So now you have your 2 factors. So hopefully you see that now the 2 factors in both of them match. So the 2 factors for the 4-term grouping are the same 2 factors I got for the box method. They're written backwards from each other, but it's okay. They're the same, so the methods are the same. It doesn't matter which one you use. I prefer the 4-term grouping, but that's just because I don't like drawing a box every time. So we're going to do 2 more examples. I'll do the box with one, 4-term grouping with another, so you can see both things happen. And then you can pick the method you like the best. So let's look at number 11. So number 11, I've got 7x cubed plus 2x squared plus 28x plus 8. And so I'm going to use a box for this one. So I'm going to draw my box just like before. And then I'm going to fill it in with my 4 terms that I have. So I've got 7x cubed plus 2x squared plus 28x plus 8. I'm going to have to go pull out the greatest common factor of each one of those terms. And if you need to draw your T's so that you can list them out, go ahead and do. I'm not going to do it this time because I want to not take up so much space. But just if you need to check it, you can. So for this first row right here, I got 7x cubed and 2x squared. Well, 7 and 2, the greatest common factor is 1. That's the only number that will go into both of those prime numbers. But now I've got an x cubed and an x squared. Well, that tells me the smallest exponent is a 2, that I'm going to have x squared in common. Then for the bottom row, 28x and 8, if I start thinking about factors of 28 and 8, the greatest common factor for those 2 numbers happens to be a 4. This 4 will go into 28 7 times and it'll go into 8 2 times. They don't both have a variable, so no variable goes here. Now this column, 7x cubed and 28x, the greatest common factor for 7 and 28 is 7. That's the biggest number that will go into both of those. And then for the x cubed and the x, they're going to have one x in common because that's the fewest number of x's I have in that row. And then for this one, 2x squared and 8, the biggest number that will go into 2 and into 8 is 2, and they have nothing else in common. So my 2 factors for this become x squared plus 4 and 7x plus 2. And so that's how you use the box method. If you need to go draw your T-charts out and list it out so you can find your greatest common factor, please do. I just didn't want to take up all that space and that time. I wanted you to be able to just see, here's the box method, here's how it works. Now I will use T-charts for this one because we're going to do 4-term grouping. And I want you to be able to see how it all goes together. So I'm going to do number 12 here. And so number 12, it's already written as 4 terms. So the first thing I'm going to do is group them together. And so I have 2d cubed minus d squared. So I've got to list out my factors. So for 2, my factors are just 1 and 2. And then I have my d's. And then for D, my factors are just 1 and 1. And then I have D times D. And so let's get what they have in common together. So they have this 1 in common, and then they have 2 D's in common. So my greatest common factor is 1D squared. And when I take that out, what's left is 2D. And there's a minus sign here, so it goes minus 1. And so then I'm going to keep this minus sign here, and it's going to be important in just a minute that that minus sign is there. So now what I have to do, I'm going to have to do my 6D and my 3. So the factors of 6 are going to be 1 and 6, 2 and 3, and then my D. And then for the 3, I have 1 and 3. Well, the biggest number they have in common is this 3, and that is it. There is nothing else. So I'm going to pull out this 3, but when I take it out, it becomes a negative 3 because that minus sign inside changes it. And so what's left here is a 2 and a D. And we're all good because when I do this minus 3 times this 2D, it becomes minus 6D, which is what I want. But now in order to make this a plus sign, this minus has to be multiplied times another minus, because the only way to make that a positive is to do a negative times a negative. So then what's remaining in this one is just the 1. So I now have my 2 terms. And so my parentheses match, 2D minus 1 and 2D minus 1. Here's where there's a potential for them not to match. If you don't pay attention to this minus sign in front and you don't change this sign, they won't match, and you'll have to go back and look at it. But if you keep up with that negative, then they'll match and you'll be okay. So one of my factors is 2D minus 1 because that's what the parentheses say. My other factor is this that's not in parentheses, which is the D squared minus 3. So there's your answer. 4-term grouping or box method, they both give you the same answer. I don't care which one you choose to do. And then we also have factoring with the GCF, and it will say in your homework which one you need to use. It'll either say factor using the GCF or it'll say factor with 4-term grouping. You can't use 4-term grouping if you don't have 4 terms anyway. So if there's not 4 terms, it's GCF. So we'll practice this when you come to class tomorrow. I will see you then.